Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this press conference of the International Observer Mission to the parliamentary elections in Georgia. Thanks to all of you who have come in person in such numbers, as well as those who are joining us online. You're all most welcome. Up here on the podium, we have representatives of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the European Parliament, and the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. We'll begin with statements from up here on the podium, and there will then be plenty of time for your questions. I first give the floor to Pascal Alizar, who is Special Coordinator and Leader of the OSCE Short-Term Observer Mission. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Katia. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear representatives of the media, welcome and thank you all for your attending presence our press conference. My name is Pascal Alizar. I am a member of the French Senate and serve as the chair of the Rules Committee of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I am addressing you today in my capacity of Special Coordinator and leader of the OSCE Short-Term Observer Mission to these 2024 parliamentary elections in Georgia. I would like to warmly thank my colleagues present here, Ewan Murphy, leading the OSCE ODIHR mission, Julian Boulay, leading the delegation from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Antonio Lopez Historic White, head of the European Parliament delegation, Feik Ostrak, head of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly delegation, and last but not least, my dear colleague Pia Coma, heading the delegation of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, for their constructive and fruitful cooperation during this mission. Our international election observation mission was truly a joint effort and comprehensive undertaking. The high number of international observers present on occasion of this election testifies the strong support of the international community to Georgia and its people. Indeed, our joint mission was composed of 530 observers from 42 countries deployed through the country on election day, including 380 OSCE ODIHR observers and experts, 61 parliamentary observers from OSCE PA, 39 from PACE, 38 from the NATO PA, and 12 from the European Parliament. I would like to thank everyone who was present on the ground observing these important elections, both yesterday but also those who have been conducting a long-term and qualitative monitoring since the start of the campaign. Our joint assessment of the election process is based on our observers' election days assessment, combined together as well as the long-term and qualitative monitoring performed by the ODIHR. We will now present to you the main conclusions and findings of our joint international election observation mission. Our complete statement will be available to you all shortly. While the 26 October parliamentary elections offered voters a wide choice with 18 candidate lists, they unfold amid entrenched polarization in an environment marred by concern over recently adopted legislation, its impact on fundamental freedoms and civil society. Contestants could generally campaign freely, while campaign rhetoric and imagery was highly divisive. Reports of pressure on voters, particularly on public sector employees, remain widespread in the campaign. This, coupled with extensive tracking on voters on election day, raise concerns about the ability of some voters to cast their vote without fear of retribution. The legal framework provides an adequate basis for democratic elections, but recent frequent amendments marked a step backward, raising concerns over its potential use for political gain. Preparations for the election were well administered, including extensive voter education on the use of the new voting technologies. A significant imbalance in financial resources and advantage of incumbency contributed to an already uneven playing field. The polarized media environment and instrumentalization of private outlets for political propaganda affected impartial news coverage, hindering voters' ability to make an informed choice. Effectiveness of campaign finance oversight was undermined by limited enforcement and concerns over the impartiality and political instrumentalization of the oversight body. The underrepresentation of women on party lists on the campaign demonstrates a need for greater commitment to ensure adequate involvement in political life. Election days was generally procedurally well organized and administered in an orderly manner, but marked by a tense environment with frequent compromise on vote secrecy and several procedural inconsistencies, as well as report of intimidation and pressures on voters that negatively impacted public trust in the process. This is the overall picture. It's evident, including through the strong presence of our international observers through the country yesterday, that this year's parliamentary election have taken place at a crucial time for Georgia. The country's European Union path and the future of its accession process have dominated the constant discoursing during the campaign. The need for further reforms to improve the legislative framework of the country, including the elections, was highlighted by most people we have met during this mission. Imbalances in financial resources, a divisive campaign atmosphere, and recent legislative amendments were of significant concern through this election process. Yet, the engagement shown on election day from the active voter participation, robust presence of citizens and party observers, a rich diversity of voices gives the sign of a system that is still growing and evolving with a democratic vitality under construction. I would like to take a moment to particularly commend the men, but mostly the women of this country, who in a big numbers administrate the elections in polling stations yesterday. I think they are the only truly carrying out the country's democratic effort. Also, polarization remains a trademark of the political scene in Georgia. As we have observed during these intermissions, voters were provided with a wide choice between a variety of political voices. The media landscape reflects this deep polarization. The instrumentalization of media outlets for political propaganda, coupled with the lack of impartial analysis of party program and the refusal of leading political actors and parties to debate them, extends the divisive political rhetoric and impact voters' ability to make an informed choice. Election day was generally procedurally well organized and administered in an orderly manner, but was marked by a tense environment and widespread intimidation. Yesterday was the first time electronic devices were used in most polling stations, and the election administration made a significant effort to educate voters on their use ahead of the election day. I would like to conclude by expressing my sincere hope for the people of this country that the leadership elected yesterday will effectively tackle the key challenge facing the nation and bring Georgia ever closer to its declared goal of the European Union membership. I would like to thank the authorities of Georgia for their cooperation during this mission, and my very heartfelt gratitude to the people of Georgia who offered a very warm welcome to our observers on election day. Now I would like to pass the floor to my colleagues and partners so they may also share their assessments with you and their impressions. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now move on to Julian Bulay, who heads the PACE delegation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Julian Bulay, and I had the pleasure and the honor to lead the election observation delegation of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, better known as PACE. I'm a member of the Romanian Parliament, and in Strasbourg at PACE, I'm the chair of the Liberal Group, the ALDE Group. The PACE delegation was particularly happy to cooperate with the delegations from OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, from the European Parliament, from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and of course with the election observation mission of the ODIHR. May I thank all my colleagues present at this table for the smooth and fruitful cooperation in the framework of our international election observation mission. PACE was invited by the authorities of the country to observe these elections because Georgia is under the monitoring procedure of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and has therefore committed to invite the Assembly to observe elections and abide to its obligations as a member state of the Council of Europe. A month ago, I led a cross-party pre-electoral delegation to Georgia. At that time, we had concluded that the political landscape had reached unprecedented levels, turning the forthcoming elections into a de facto referendum on Georgia's democratic trajectory and foreign alignment. This impression was confirmed during our election mission. Let me highlight some key points highlighted by our observers and concerns expressed about the electoral conditions. The quality of the elections reflected the trends we noted during the pre-electoral period, including questions about impartiality of state institutions. We were concerned about hate speech against civil society and dissenting opinions triggered by the controversial law on transparency of foreign influence. During our observation, we noted cases of vote buying and double voting before and during elections, especially in rural areas. We experienced two different worlds. one inside polling stations, where the voting process was in general well administered, and one outside the polling stations. The presence of cameras of the ruling party in the polling stations and people in front of polling stations tracking and possibly controlling voters led widespread climate of pressure and party-organized intimidation and a feeling of Big Brother is watching you, as one of our observers depicted it. Uneven playing field and the deficiencies we just noted in the election process undermine the trust, its outcome, and its fairness. I underline its outcome and its fairness. This explains the reaction to the election results. I should also mention that while observing inside a polling station in the countryside, one of the PACE teams had its car vandalized. These issues need now to be addressed by the authorities in the framework of the monitoring procedure of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I would like to thank my PACE delegation of 39 persons. It was composed of 31 members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, representing all 5 political groups and coming from 21 different European member states. We were, as always, accompanied by the representatives of the Council of Europe's Venice Commission. I will later present a comprehensive report and recommendations at our next plenary session in Strasbourg. Thank you all for your attention. I'm ready to answer any particular question you may have.
Thank you so much. We now turn to Pia Kalmar, who heads the OSCE delegation.
Thank you, Katja, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I want to express my deep appreciation to my colleagues from the ODIHR and all our international partners, as well as the many observers for their excellent cooperation throughout our election observation mission. My name is Pia Kauma, and I'm a parliamentarian from Finland, as well as president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. It was an honor for me to lead a team of 60 OSCE EPA observers from 22 different countries who came together to observe these important elections here in Georgia. I want to highlight that our teams were warmly welcomed across the country, not just here in Tbilisi, but also in Tel Aviv, Signahi, Gori, Borjomi, Bolnisi, Akhalnisikhe, and Batumi. Personally, I had the privilege of observing the process here in Tbilisi, and I was able to experience the engagement of many citizens firsthand. Let me extend my sincere gratitude to everyone for the warm hospitality shown to our observers. We closely monitored every step of the election day process, from the opening of polling stations to the voting and counting, with all of our missions observers able to be present in just over half of all the polling stations throughout the entire country. Let me hereby address the representation of women in politics, not just as one of the few women on this podium. I personally met many engaged, enthusiastic and hard-working women prior and during election day, central to the administration of the process, but also prominently active and engaged within civil society. However, the decline in female candidates due to the removal of gender quotas is a setback for diversity, especially as women's active participation at polling stations highlights not just their vital role, but also their demand for greater representation. Lastly, let me come back to the deep polarization in Georgia, which we all have followed closely with concern over the past months and even years. With the recent adoption of the law on transparency of foreign influence, I hope its implications for freedom of association and expression will be re-evaluated in the next parliament to protect civil society's vital work in Georgia and continue to ensure all voices will be heard. For a democracy, its true strength is deeply tied to embracing debate, no matter how fierce, as it holds our governments accountable and protects the freedoms we all cherish. For the sake of time, I will finish here, but I'm ready to answer any questions you might have. And once more, let me thank the people of Georgia for their warm hospitality.
Many thanks. We now move on to Faye Kozczak, who heads the delegation from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished members of press. Allow me to begin with a clarification. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly is separate from NATO. I only speak on behalf of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, not NATO. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly's partnership with Georgia began 25 years ago. It is one of our most important ones. We have been a champion of Georgia, its democracy, and the Georgian people's aspiration to join the EU and NATO. Respect for the shared values of individual liberty, democracy, and the rule of law is an essential condition for becoming a member of NATO and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Since Russia started its full-scale war against Ukraine in February 2022, we have redoubled our efforts to support Georgia. But in recent months, we have also made clear that Georgia stands at a decisive crossroads. We have publicly stated that the law on the so-called transparency of foreign influence was a step backwards for the country's democratic consolidation. This election was also another critical test for Georgia's democracy, and its aftermath will be another. That is why we decided to observe this election when we were invited, as we have done during every national election in Georgia since 2008. Our statement notes a number of negative elements in this election. My colleagues have already addressed many of these, but what has personally worried me most was the tense, deeply polarized environment, instances of intimidation and pressure on voters outside polling stations, compromises of vote secrecy, an uneven playing field, and the highly divisive rhetoric and imagery, for example, on banning key opposition parties. It is now my duty to report back on these elections so that the Assembly can calibrate its relationship with the Georgian Parliament and explore how to best support the Georgian people, who have demonstrated again and again that they want a democratic Georgia in the EU and in NATO. Our statement today clearly outlines many of the difficulties Georgia faces on its path of democratic reform and consolidation. That is yet another reason why the NATO PA will continue to press for the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO headquarters to defend and advocate for democracy and be a resource not only for our members, but also for partners like Georgia. And to finish, I would like to thank the 29 members of Parliament from the NATO PA delegation, coming from 11 NATO member countries and 9 of our staff, for their dedication and hard work over the last few days. And I must also thank all the other delegations for their cooperation, and especially ODR and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and as well as Georgian authorities and Georgian people for their important support to our delegation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the head of the delegation from the European Parliament, Antonio López Istúriz White.
Thank you very much. My name is Antonio López Istúriz. I am a Spanish member of the European Parliament, and I am leading a delegation of 7 members representing 5 countries and 5 political groups. Important to see this diversity in our final conclusions and findings and observations from all of my colleagues. We came here as part of the OSCE, or the International Election Observation Mission. Let me, of course, first thank all my colleagues from all the other 3 parliamentary assemblies and the ODIHR, which I believe for a very excellent cooperation. Our delegation broadly subscribes to the statement of the preliminary findings and conclusions of the International Election Observation Mission. When we assess these elections, we cannot just consider the election day itself. Elections are very much about what transpired before and will happen after the day of the elections. In this respect, let me say a word on the work of the International Election Observation. It has been reported by the press and the ruling party on election night that international observers comment positively on elections. How is it possible when we are holding our press conference only now? Reliable election observation is the one based on long-term observation, deep analysis of the entire context of the electoral process before, during, and after the election day. This is the reason we are here today all together to tell you about the findings of a serious long-term election observation. Let me now turn to the broader context. Georgia was granted candidate status in December 2023 on the understanding that it would fulfill conditions and take steps set out in the Commission's recommendations of 8 November 2023. Instead of using this historic opportunity, the Georgian Parliament adopted several controversial laws which had very negative consequences for Georgia's European aspirations. The most prominent of them is the law on transparency of foreign influence. It was adopted despite mass protests by Georgian citizens and repeated calls from Georgia's European partners to withdraw the draft law that in spirit and content contradicts European Union's norms and values. Georgia's EU accession process was effectively frozen as a direct consequence of its adoption. It is a regrettable development, considering that Georgia was once a champion of democratic progress with Euro-Atlantic aspirations. During the electoral campaign, the ruling party used anti-Western and hostile rhetoric, targeting Georgia's democratic partners, in particular the European Union, its politicians and diplomats, promoted Russian disinformation, manipulation and conspiracy theories. Paradoxically, the government further claimed that it was continuing Georgia's European integration. We also regretted the fact that less than a year before the elections, the Georgian Parliament adopted amendments to the country's electoral code that modified fundamental aspects of the country's electoral legislation, abolishing mandatory parliament quotas for women on parliamentary candidate lists, and changing the composition of the Central Election Commission. We were particularly concerned about the reports of the violence, intimidation, hate speech, persecution and repression against the opposition, civil society and independent media. The ruling party further heightened the tensions by stating its intention to seek legal action for banning certain opposition parties. The Georgian people were presented with stark choices. The ruling party claimed that choosing between itself and the opposition was a choice between peace and war, whereas the opposition presented this as a referendum on Georgia's geopolitical orientation. Although outwardly the campaign was quite subdued, there were signs that efforts were underway to undermine and manipulate the vote. Once again, there were reports of misuse of public resources and administrative capacity for the benefit of the ruling party, pressure exerted on civil servants to participate in campaign events and vote. We were alerted by various interlocutors about confiscation of identification documents. There were examples of institutions such as the newly established Anti-Corruption Bureau being instrumentalized for political purposes during the campaign. All the above measures taken together paint a clear picture of a sophisticated, widespread and well-orchestrated scheme. Let me say a few words about the election day. Our delegation observed the vote and the counting in many cities and regions: Tbilisi, Metsheha, Gori, Tel Aviv, Lagodehi, Marnueli, Bolnisi. We met many attentive and dedicated staff working in the polling stations. Their job was particularly challenging this year, not only for political reasons. It was the first time that a fully proportional representation system was used. It was also the first time that electronic devices were used for voter identification and counting in the vast majority of polling stations. This was a challenge for some voters, but also for some members of the present election commission. We were surprised to see cameras in all precincts, which was not foreseen by the current legislation. Our European Parliament teams witnessed in some precincts high tension, confusion and chaos. In one case, ballot box stuffing, physical assault on observers attempting to report on violations, observer and media removal from polling stations, tearing up observers' complaints, intimidation of voters inside and outside of polling stations, presence of multiple party-affiliated observers posing as citizen observers. Furthermore, voting secrecy was not always assured. We do support the continuous commitment of the Georgian people to democracy, sovereignty, and freedom of their country. We express deep concern about the democratic backsliding in Georgia. The conduct of yesterday's election is unfortunately evidence to that effect. We fear that the climate of hatred and intimidation that was also mentioned before we witnessed on the election day could seriously undermine the political process in Georgia. It is important that the reported violations during the election day are investigated and addressed. We invite the Georgian authorities to fully implement the recommendations of the OSCE ODIHR International Election Observation Mission. Georgians cast their vote yesterday, choosing among different parties and coalitions. This democratic choice is a fundamental right, and taking legal steps to ban opposition parties is unacceptable for a democracy. We will continue to support democratic aspirations of the Georgian people. Thank you very much, Didi Madlova.
Thank you very much. And finally, last but not least, I give the floor to Owen Murphy, who heads the ODIHR Election Observation Mission.
Thank you, Katia. And thank you all for coming today. You're all very welcome. And I'd like to also thank the people of Georgia for their warm welcome and their hospitality. The ODIHR component of our election observation mission has been in Georgia since the beginning of September. And our core team has been based here in Tbilisi with long-term observers deployed across the country since the middle of September. And members of the core team have also made visits to different regions of the country as part of our work. And I want to thank the people of Georgia for the reception they have given us when we have made those visits. Today we together publish a statement of preliminary findings and conclusions, and I will base my remarks on that document. These elections, as have been noted, were the first held under a fully proportional electoral system. They were also the first to witness the widespread introduction of new voting technologies. However, these significant electoral changes took place against a backdrop of a deeply polarized political environment, which has been further marred by concerns over recently adopted legislation and its impact upon fundamental freedoms and on civil society. And it is also important to note that recent changes to the election laws earlier this year reversed some previously existing positive provisions. For example, the abolition of gender quotas, which has been mentioned, as well as amendments to the composition of the Central Election Commission. Some words specifically on the campaign. We have had 30 long-term observers deployed across the country since the 19th of September, and they have attended more than 50 campaign events, as well as observing other campaign activities. We also observed campaigning on social networks, which is unregulated. The campaign was competitive, and contestants could generally campaign freely, but overall, and notwithstanding some larger public events in the final days of the campaign period, the campaign was subdued. And it is worth noting that highly divisive rhetoric and imagery was used in contestants' campaigns, and both ruling and opposition parties reported incidents of attacks against their campaign people and their campaign property. Turning now to some more specific elements of the campaign, throughout the period there were reports of intimidation, coercion and pressure on voters, especially on public sector employees and the economically vulnerable. This raised concerns about the ability of some voters to freely form their opinions and cast their vote without fear. This is at odds with OSCE commitments and international standards. The ruling party enjoyed a vast financial advantage over all of its competitors, but public trust in the transparency and the effectiveness and impartiality of campaign finance oversight, including some of the activities of the new Anti-Corruption Bureau, was limited. In relation to the media, between the 18th of September and the 25th of October, we conducted quantitative and qualitative monitoring of 6 TV stations and 2 online media outlets. This monitoring showed bias across all monitored outlets. Furthermore, it showed that legal obligations for impartial news coverage went unimplemented on commercial television. And the public broadcaster devoted significantly more time to the ruling party in the news. Together with a lack of impartial analysis of party programs by the media and the refusal of leading political actors and parties to debate in the media, meant that voters' ability to make an informed choice was challenged. In advance of Election Day, the election administration managed technical aspects of the elections efficiently and transparently. However, public perception of the impartiality of election administration was negatively impacted by concerns about the recent amendments which I mentioned earlier, which, as an example, included the cancellation of the opposition-nominated deputy chairperson position. On Election Day, new voting technologies were introduced in this election with the stated aim of reducing the risk of manipulation and human error. In most cases, voting was assessed as procedurally well organized. However, procedures at 6% of the 1,924 polling stations that were assessed negatively, and that is a significant number. The recording of voters within polling stations by party representatives, while not against the law, had an intimidating effect and potentially compromised the secrecy of the vote. And in 24% of observations, voter secrecy was potentially compromised by the manner of casting the ballots by voters, including while using the new technology and issues of overcrowding in polling station layouts. While our observers found the new devices in polling stations were mostly operational, they also noted that the majority of voters in polling stations observed had difficulties with inserting their ballots in the devices. Furthermore, the combination of the introduction of new technology and an increased number of voters in polling stations using electronic devices sometimes delayed the process and led to queues in 40% of our observations. Despite efforts to improve accessibility, 65% of polling stations were difficult for wheelchair users to access, and 41% had unsuitable interior layouts. There were several reported incidents of physical altercations and intimidation, and we also note in our report that Election Day was marked by a tense environment. And when you do have a chance to look at our published report, you'll see a lot more details in terms of facts and figures coming from the thousands of polling stations that were observed by our observers across Election Day. And just finally then, an important point to make about citizen observers. Contributing to the transparency of the electoral process, several civil society groups conducted long-term observation activities. But many civil society organizations reported on the stigmatizing impact of the law on transparency of foreign influence following its adoption, and that they are working in an environment of undue pressure being exerted on them individually as well as on their activities. And this is at odds with the country's OSCE commitments, and it is concerning. As part of the one joint effort from this international election observation mission, more than 500 short-term observers were deployed across Election Day. I would very much like to take this opportunity to thank the heads of the parliamentary delegations that I've had the pleasure to work with over this period. And they are joined with me on the podium today. But in particular, I would like to recognize the Special Coordinator, Pascal Alizard, for his leadership of the International Election Observation Mission. The OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights will remain in Georgia to follow any election-related complaints and appeals. And I'd like to note that more than 400 were lodged across the country on Election Day. We will continue working with the national authorities after the election process has concluded, including by publishing a final report, which will contain recommendations to improve the process for future elections, and we will do that in a few months' time. I'd like to sincerely thank those members of our observation team who were recruited locally, who are citizens of Georgia, and who played a crucial role in our mission across the country. I want to thank them for their dedication as well as for their professionalism. Thank you. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the host authorities for their full cooperation throughout our deployment, in particular the Central Election Commission and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Such cooperation is essential in doing our work according to our methodology and our mandate. And finally, I'd like to thank the interpreters for their assistance today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for your attention. Now there's time for your questions. Before we start, I wanted to say that while you're all very welcome here today, this is a press conference and we will only be taking questions from journalists. I'd therefore be grateful if you could begin by introducing yourself and your media outlet before you ask your question. I also wanted to mention the fact that we do have simultaneous translation here today, and so you're welcome to put your questions in English or in Georgian. I see quite a few questions, so I think we'll just go left from the podium, left to right. The gentleman here. Please go ahead. If you could just wait for the microphone. I'm sorry, I think you'll need to wait because the translators are...
Hello. Oh, yeah, there we go. Gabriel Gavin, Politico. Question for Mr. White. You've painted a very bleak picture of Georgia's democracy in your assessment. In a word, was this election stolen?
Give me the second.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gavin. I'm not here, my colleagues and I, we are not here to state if these elections are stolen or not. We are here to, as I did, to tell you, everybody, the findings, the observations that we did during this process, also what we listened before, to testimonies before the elections, and also our worries about the post-election atmosphere or situation. Not here to comment in the validity or not of these elections. Is part of this job description of the mission. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Nino Gelashvili. I'm from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Georgian service. And we listened to your preliminary information, assessments. My question would be, whatever you have already witnessed and whatever you have already documented, does that help or hinder Georgia's return to its European trajectory, which it was stated before, had been stated before the elections, that country derailed from that trajectory? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. In my opinion, it's too premature to tell anything about that. It really depends on what happens after the election, what kind of government will be constituted, and also what kind of steps the new government will be taking as regards the addition to the European Union. But to my understanding, it has been also stated in the Constitution that this is the aim of this people.
Please, lady here in the striped top.
მთავარი არხი მადლობას გიხდით იმ საქმისთვის, რომელიც გაწიეთ საქართველოში ამ დღეების განმავლობაში. მე მინდა გკითხოთ, თქვენ ყველამ დეტალურად ისაუბრეთ იმ დარღვევებზე, რომელიც აღმოაჩინეთ ამ პერიოდის განმავლობაში, რომელიც მედიამ გადაიღო, მაგალითად არჩევნების დღეს იყო ეს მანამდე პირადობის მოწმობების ჩამორთმევა ამ მომრჩევლებისთვის, ასევე უბნებზე იყო დაფიქსირებული თანხის გადახდის მცდელობები, რომელიც კადრებით დადასტურებულად გვაქვს, მაგალითად ჩვენს მედიას გადაღებული, ასევე მრავალი სხვა დარღვევა. ვიცით რომ არ გახსნეს უბნები, მათ შორის საზღვარგარეთ, მხოლოდ იმიტომ რომ იციან რომ ემიგრანტები არიან ოპოზიციის ამომრჩევლები. ამ ყველაფრის გათვალისწინებით მინდა გკითხოთ, რამდენად არის საფუძველი, მაინტერესებს თქვენს ანგარიშებში თუ მოხდა მსგავსი დარღვევები და თუ არის საფუძველი ეს ყველაფერი იმისა, რომ დადგეს არჩევნების ლეგიტიმაციის საკითხი კითხვის ნიშნის ქვეშ.
Thank you for your question, and your question essentially about violations that were observed on election day. Just to reiterate that, working together, our delegations had more than 500 short-term observers deployed across the country. As a result of that number of observers, we were able to make more than 2,000 polling station visits. We have a very rigorous methodology that we work to. I know that people in the media would have seen accusations of ballot box stuffing in at least one location, and we note in the report that the Central Election Commission then invalidated the results from that polling station. We also noted, and we heard concerns before Election Day, about this issue around the collection of voter IDs and using it to put pressure on voters. There were allegations, there were concerns. The ombudsperson made a statement on the matter. In terms of our own observations on that matter, we noticed one case of multiple voting, and we also noted a few occasions where attempts were made but were denied by those authorities. But if you turn to the details of our Election Day report section in the report, we have a series of statistics, and I'll give a few more now just for completeness if it might help in terms of the types of things that we've been looking at. So, for example, the external tracking of voters. That's the environment outside of polling stations that my colleague was referring to earlier. 10% of our observers, there was 10% of our observations of unknown individuals outside of polling stations, and 7% observed party representatives inside of polling stations. We had 40% of polling stations with long queues because of the new technology and limited voter numbers. We had a lack of adequate instructions for voters. In 9% of polling stations equipped with new voting technology, voters did not receive proper instructions. And of course, as has been noted, reported by some voters, in 54% of polling stations, we had concerns about difficulties in using those new voting technologies. I already mentioned the issue about ballot box stuffing. And some very limited confirmed cases of people to attempt to vote on multiple occasions. There have also been allegations of vote buying. These allegations were frequent, and we mention indication of these in our statement. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
As I'm a consensus man, we had a quote for the previous question about the European question. No? A quote that is in the, and I would like to read it again, that is already in the press statement. We said, and it's part of the quote from the European Parliament, we said, we continue to express deep concerns about democratic backsliding in Georgia. The conduct of yesterday's election is unfortunately evidence to that effect. We will continue to closely follow the situation in Georgia to see if the next government, whatever it is, chooses to realign with EU values and norms and reverses the negative tendencies of the last months. Thank you.
As I will have to catch a flight very soon, and I'll be leaving after answering you, I want to echo your concerns and the remarks you've had with everything that has happened before the election day and during the election day. And I want to reiterate my statement that all this information lead us to question the fairness of the process leading to this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just...
One second. Could the mic go down here? Thank you.
Hi, John Sparks from Sky News. You said in your presentation as the head of delegation, you said that your observers had witnessed vote buying and double voting, especially in rural areas. Is that indicative of what we have seen in this election? I think what a lot of people in this country want to know is whether this was a free and fair election.
I would reiterate what I have stated, and I will support all these elements without withdrawing a word. Thank you. So if I could just, I'm strongly supporting what I have stated, and I'm repeating for the fourth time that all this information are leading us to think that there might be a conclusion in that sense. Thank you.
If I could just, because I think it's an important question, talk a bit about the legal framework, because we have spoken about this in our document. And when it comes to looking at the legal framework for conducting democratic elections, we do note that it is adequate. But we've also noted that recent and frequent amendments represent a step backwards. Part of the work that we do is to provide recommendations. We're invited here by the host authorities. We're part of the OSCE. Georgia is an OSCE participating state. So this is our, I think, 18th occasion being here. And on each occasion that we come for an election, our responsibility is to provide constructive recommendations for improving the electoral process. And we intend to do that when we publish a final report in a few months' time. But what I can speak to is previous recommendations that have come from urgent legal opinions and which are available on the website, which we recommend a comprehensive legal reform and to do it well in advance of the next elections and to do it in an inclusive way, including with civil society organizations. In the past, in the recent past, we have seen changes to the electoral law that followed that principle. But more recently this year, and I think I noted it in my statements, there were changes to the electoral law, and we saw them as a step backwards, and that's how we describe it in our report. But just to then echo some of my colleagues' earlier statements, because I think it is very important to understand what our role is as observers, and just to reiterate the point, we're not here to produce a final verdict on the elections or to adjudicate on the results for the people of Georgia. We're here to present the people of Georgia with a detailed assessment of the process in a number of areas: campaign finance, the media, the campaign itself, political parties, registration of voters, registration of candidates, election administration, all of these areas, and how that process met or did not meet those standards that Georgia has in its own laws, that it's agreed to in terms of international standards, and the commitments it's made to the OSCE. And it's then up to the people of Georgia to decide, based on that very detailed assessment. And of course, I think it's important to reiterate as well, I think more than 400 complaints were made yesterday on election day. A lot of people are concerned about things that they saw in the media, on social media, that was shared with them perhaps over their own communications networks. We remain in the country to follow the election dispute and resolution process so that if people have these concerns, if they have evidence, they take them to the appropriate authorities, through the commissions, through the courts, and we are here to then track that process and see where that comes to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry.
Maybe, as my colleagues already commented, an election is always a complex process, and it would be neither fair nor responsible to reduce it to a simple black and white assessment. However, we did acknowledge the advantage of the government party in terms of their financial resources and the fact that they are the incumbent within our report. As in all electoral competitors, this does have an effect how parties may be able to reach voters, and also contributes to an unlevel playing field, which is also written out in our report.
Thank you very much. The gentleman here, then.
Okay, thank you so much.
Here, and then we go back in this direction. Okay, please.
I am from TV channel Rustavi 2, Miriam Gorgodze. I would like go to directly on the final results. So the violations and irregularities generally, how will affect on the final results? If you can say. ანუ ის დარღვევები, რაზეც თქვენ საუბრობთ, რომელსაც ჰქონდა ადგილი წინა საარჩევნო კამპანიის დროს, მოახდენს თუ არა რაიმე ეფექტს არჩევნების საბოლოო შედეგებზე. და თუ შეიძლება ბატონ ეუჯინ მერფისთან მექნება ეს შეკითხვა, როდესაც საუბარი იყო იმასთან დაკავშირებით, რომ იყო შემთხვევები განმეორებითი ხმის მიცემის თაობაზე. თუ შეიძლება გვითხრათ უფრო კონკრეტულად, სად მოხდა ეს შემთხვევები კონკრეტულად.
Thank you for your question. Great, thank you. Yeah, so I think as I mentioned earlier, everyone's very well aware of the one precinct where the Central Election Commission invalidated the results because there was clear evidence of ballot box stuffing. And so we note that in our report. It's one out of more than 3,000 polling stations. We also have in our statistics places where our observers noted irregularities in the procedures being followed in polling stations. The important thing is when it comes to people having observed what they believe to be an irregularity or they believe to be something that shouldn't have occurred, that they have the opportunity to take that complaint to the relevant authorities and that that complaint be dealt with appropriately. Now, we have noted that in the pre-election day campaign that there is a problem in terms of trust in some of the adjudication measures that may or may not be taken by people if they wish to go down that route. But in relation to the issue of multiple voting, what I can say is that, very limited confirmed cases of multiple voting were observed directly by our more than 500 observers, and there were only a few of attempts. Some of those attempts were stopped, so it's not referred to in the statement. Thank you.
Please go ahead. If you could just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Bulat. I'm from Doxa Media. It's a Russian language youth media in exile. So my question is, do you consider sanctions on Georgian officials responsible for election fraud? And the second one is how the election results will affect Georgia's European integration, and is the dream of millions of Georgians, including young Georgians, dream to join the European Union now doomed? Thank you.
Humbly, it's not up to me to talk about sanctions. So you will have to refer to the appropriate people. Again, to be clear, I do not only speak about democracy, I practice it. So again, I will tell you what was the common statement that united all of us members of the European Parliament from different groups in stating that we will continue to closely follow the situation in Georgia to see if the next government chooses to realign with European Union values and norms and reverse the negative tendencies of the last months. Thank you.
Thank you. The three ladies here, the two next to each other and the one in front, please. One after another, not at the same time.
Hello. Ekaterina Postnikova, RBC Media Group from Russia. I would like to ask the OSCE representatives to comment on the following statements from the Russian officials. They made right before the OSCE mission arrived in Georgia, so it was in September. And in particular, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service accused the organization, the office, of possible interference in the elections. So what would you respond to these statements and to these accusations? Thank you.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think in my remarks, our election observation mission, the core team, deployed here to the country on the 10th of September. And around the time that we were deploying, allegations were made about the method in which we conduct our work. And at the time, I said, and I'll repeat it now, I'm not going to respond to individual statements that might be made that might be seen to undermine the work that we do. But our methodology, there are 57 participating states in the OSCE. They each have made a commitment to invite observers for their elections to come and do the full assessment that we've been talking about for these elections in Georgia. And that is a very important commitment that they've made, and it's a commitment that's been followed through on by the Georgian authorities again on this occasion. And as I said, we had the full cooperation from the host authorities in organizing all of the meetings that we had to organize. In terms of how we do our work, I think across the short-term observer component, we had members from 44 different participating states. Every participating state is free to second a long-term observer or a short-term observer. We deploy our teams in multinational teams, the long-term observers, and the core team had a multinational composition as well. And the methodology of our work, in terms of how we conduct our meetings, who we meet, working to the standards, working to the commitments, that's what we're assessing things against. That's how we do our work. Some people said that we had written the interim report before we had arrived, but if you read our interim report that was published on the 11th of October, it is full of details that had happened in the preceding weeks before we had come. So that tells you the kind of work that we do and the fact-based approach that we take to our observations. And just in case there was an additional element or a question around potential disinformation in the campaign coming from anywhere at all, we did monitor social media throughout the campaign period. I think I mentioned earlier on in my remarks that it's unregulated. Many expressed concerns to us about the potential for foreign interference, and not even foreign interference, but just domestic misinformation. And there were statements made about it over the course of the campaign by various contestants in the campaign. But from our monitoring, there was no clear indication of the extent or the impact of any alleged actions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I agree entirely in Mr. Murphy's assessment, and I would also like to emphasize that in OSCE we have 57 participating states, and we apply exactly the same kind of methods and principles in all countries. Last weekend we were deploying an election observation mission in Moldova, and now as we speak we are deploying one mission in Uzbekistan, and in less than 2 weeks' time we apply exactly the same kind of principles in the United States.
Hello, I'm Anna from TV Medi. I want to ask a question with you, Ms. Pia Kauma. We have already heard the remarks from the morning. We have also heard positive evolutions from different international observers, both negative and very positive reviews. Please tell us whether this election was competitive or not.
These elections were competitive, and I base it on the fact that the voters were able to choose between 18 different candidate lists. And this election was not just a choice between ruling party and the opposition, but also opposition parties were in a harsh and genuine competition between each other.
გამარჯობა, ტელეკომპანია მაესტრო, ნინი გოგიშვილი. ჩვენ მოვისმინეთ თქვენგან, რომ ზოგიერთ დარღვევასთან დაკავშირებით ახლა მიმდინარეობს გადამოწმება, ზოგიერთი დადასტურებულია, თუმცა იმ შემთხვევაში თუ თქვენს მიერ ჩამოთვლილი ყველა დარღვევა დადასტურდა ან ნაწილი. ეს მოახდენს თუ არა არჩევნების შედეგებზე გავლენას, კონკრეტული პასუხი რომ გაგვცეთ ამ შეკითხვასთან დაკავშირებით. მადლობა.
Thank you. It will have an impact on our statement and the reaction afterwards by the European institutions. After we find out, we are asking, again, sorry if I refer always to this, the opinion of all my colleagues and myself, that the investigations are addressed, that the violations during and after the election day are investigated and addressed. If this is the case, then I'm sure afterwards we will be in a position to talk about it.
And if I could add to that as well, because I might have, I'm not sure I said it earlier on, but we are going to keep a component. I mean, the core team is going to stay here in Georgia to follow the process that you've just talked about. If people, where they feel that there has been a serious infraction or any infraction at all and want to take that case through the mechanisms that are here and available to the people of Georgia, we'll stay in the country to monitor that. And then in a few months' time, when we publish our final report, which may contain and will contain recommendations on how to improve the electoral process, there'll also be a chance to properly reflect what happened in the post-election day period when it comes to things like election dispute resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The three ladies there, one in the white shirt first. This one. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. My question, I'm from the Norwegian paper Altinget. My question is to Mr. White and Alessandro. Now we've heard that this election was competitive. Can you both tell us whether or not this election was free and fair? And I'm sorry to stress this, but since we have now concluded that the election was competitive, then it's open to say and conclude whether or not it was free and fair. Thank you.
Who's addressed? In my case, I don't know where this word competitive comes from. Okay. It's not something, the language that we are using in our findings and in our paper. By all, no, I'm talking on behalf of the European Parliament. So there is not any mention here in our declaration about that. Thank you.
I think to be clear, I mean, just to add to the question, I mean, a campaign or an election is about more than just the campaign. It's about the things that we discuss in relation to things like voter registration, candidate registration, the electoral legal framework, the finance laws, the different bodies that are involved in investigating those finance laws. What's the media environment like? We go through all of those issues in our report. But when we talk about the campaign being competitive, we also know that it's subdued, and we also talk about contestants generally being able to campaign freely, but we then talk about reports of intimidation, coercion, and pressure on voters persisting, especially on public sector employees. And that raised concerns about the ability of some voters to freely form their opinions and cast their vote without fear. And that is at odds with OSCE commitments, excuse me. But again, just to emphasize the purpose of why we're here today, it's not to produce that final verdict on the elections or adjudicate on the results in that way. We'd make a very, very detailed assessment of each aspect of the election, and we present it to the Georgian people. And it's for them then to make their own judgment based on all those different aspects that we have highlighted in our work. Thank you.
It's not a white or a black answer. It's not possible. With 18 free candidates lists, it was a competitive election. But our observations, our remarks are very serious and are also opportunities for very large progress for Georgian people to be closer of the European Union standard. And I think it will need a comprehensive progress together. We can be positive also for the future.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. The lady in the black there has been waiting for a long time. Thank you.
Hello, hi, thank you. Maria Katamadze, Deutsche Welle. So the local observers said that there was a significant impact on the election results. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, to what extent? Or if not, please explain. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question. So, again, just to repeat so people can be clear, we can only speak to what our observers observed. And in that context, we had more than 500 observers that made more than 2,000 polling station visits. They were there for the opening, they were there for the voting, and they were there for the closing and the counting. And how we assessed the opening of polling stations was generally positive. When we look at voting, we talk about it being mostly well organized, but I did say that in 6% of more than 1,900 observations, we assessed it negatively due to indications of pressure and intimidation on voters, tension, unrest, and overcrowding. And we also talk about voter secrecy being compromised in 24% of cases, which is high. These are the conclusions that we come to in our report. And I'm sorry that you don't have it in front of you, but it is, I think, on its way to you immediately. It is a detailed report, and it has all of our statistics from all of our observations that were made across the course of yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman in green here, and I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there.
Hello, Anton Kokaya of Irel. How do you assess these elections, the pre-electoral environment and the